Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our panel at the end of the day here today. So to keep it interesting and to hopefully get everyone engaged, this is going to be a little bit interactive at the beginning. So I read once that if you took $1 million and you made a pile of $1 million with $1,000 bills, how high would that pile reach? So it's $1 million in $1,000 bills. Any guesses? How high would that pile reach? Okay, can we have a guess in the back? 4 inches? Okay, that's a great guess. So 7 inches, all right? Now, how tall would a pile in $1,000 bills to $1 billion? How high would that be? I'll kill the suspense. A little taller than the Washington Monument, okay? So I'm going to give you some numbers, really, that should knock your socks off, all right? First, COVID-19 sadly is still with us today, and that is because economists at Stanford University estimate that between 28 and 30 trillion dollars will be lost from the economy because of the learning loss that students experienced coming out of the pandemic. That turns out to about $70,000 per person between now and the year 2100. So between now and 2100, we're talking about global loss to economies of about $30 trillion. That's a big pile of $1,000 bills. So I want to open by thanking Commissioner Díaz for being here with me this afternoon. And we're going to talk about, after we get through some of the bad news, we have some good news to share with you about what Florida is doing and what's happening around the country to solve this problem of learning loss and making sure that young people are ready to enter the workforce when they finish either K-12 school, professional school, or if they decide to go to college and get a degree. But we got to get through, we have to get through some of the bad news first. So that's the first thing, is that there are, in fact, impacts on the global economy that are coming out of the learning losses from COVID-19. So, Commissioner Díaz, when we were talking before this panel, we talked about the latest release of a set of test scores from an international test. It's called PISA, and it's a test that's given to 15-year-olds in math and reading, and the scores in the U.S. were bad, and we're talking really bad. In fact, it was an 18-point drop from where we were just in the last test, which means that we're pushed back in terms of student achievement to about 1995 in the U.S., okay, in math. So we've got the learning loss coming out of the pandemic. It's being demonstrated through international tests. So what did Florida do right after COVID-19? How did Florida handle that? Because there's a really great success story about what's going on in Florida, right?
Yeah, and unfortunately, what you're talking about there is the complete wipeout of all the gains, right? So what has Florida done, and what did Florida do during the pandemic that was different? I mean, it doesn't take an educational genius, I would think, to understand that if kids are going to do better if you have them in school in front of their teachers in their regular routine and continued learning. We always look at something called summer loss. And this is important not only in the education, but for the business world, for the entire economy to understand, is when you have kids end the school year and you've made all this progress, they have 6-8 weeks off. And then depending on what's happening in the home, right? Because if we have wealthier parents, they have the ability to put kids in camps, in academic activities, and all kinds of things. When that doesn't exist, you have a summer slide, right? The kids are going to slide back. So if they gained a year's worth, they're going to slide a little back, and you're going to have to pick that up again in August. Think of doing that in some instances for 2 years, like some states in the United States did. It's catastrophic what you've done. Not only when you're talking about what these numbers look like, think about the life of each individual student. It's how it's going to be impacted. You never get third grade back, right? You never get kindergarten back. You never get, and people may think, well, the kindergarten, these are the foundational times when learning goes on. If you don't learn how to decode and how to read, you cannot read to learn. So as you're going forward, there is nothing that really makes that up. In fact, we have the data that shows if you're behind by the time you get to third grade, you never really catch up the rest of your academic career. And so what Florida did under the leadership of our governor, who was incredible during COVID, was say, we're going to open up schools. We're going to get kids back to school. And we did, the choices of parents deciding whether they stayed virtual or went back to school, granted, it's a school choice state. But schools had to be open. And we saw that even on the 2022 NAEP results, which is the national test, right?
Nation's report card.
Nation's report card. How did Florida do in comparison to even some of the states that had been ahead of us before COVID? Well, it was clear that if you looked where they closed down, and if you looked at the states that didn't, like Florida, we leaped ahead, right? It still wasn't where we want to be, but compared to those states, it was incredible. Number two, if you really want to know what's going on, you look at the low socioeconomic students, right? When you talk about the achievement gap, you're talking about the achievement gap between students who are in a higher socioeconomic class. And I would say you really have to mix in two-parent homes, right? If a kid has a two-parent home and they have a decent income, they're going to be successful. That's just what the numbers say. But what happens at these lower socioeconomic? Well, Florida, if you adjust for demographics, is in the top 3 in the nation when it comes to those scores, even during COVID. But overall, why? Because we're doing a better job of teaching those students where they are. But especially during COVID, who got hurt the most in those states? It was not the well-off students. It was not the students in a household where parents were reading to them or doing some kind of educational activity. It was those in low socioeconomic situations where there was no parent at home, or they were just there with a grandma, and they spent all that time having all that learning loss. And that impact is going to be felt for years in the economy. That's where it's going to be felt. Forget about education. In the economy, this is where you're going to have the impacts of this. And we're still looking at that COVID class, right? Like, number one, the ones that graduated, but more importantly, I go back to the first point, the ones that were entering the foundational years when they spent 2 years at home. Those are the ones we have to track.
Yeah, and that's crucial because this is 2024, right? Fall 2024, going into spring 2025. COVID hit in 2020, right? So that's 4 years, which is the length of a high school career in the United States. So you're talking about kids getting ready to graduate high school or who just graduated high school that were lucky if they had 2 years that they were able to spend actually in a classroom. So this is significant, both in terms of education as well as in terms of the workforce. Okay, last point here, because I want to talk about this. We're going to get to the specific reforms that Florida's been doing, but I wanted to mention that this didn't happen overnight. Florida has been closing the achievement gap for a while now, right?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about those stats, those lowest 25% or lowest socioeconomic students. If you look at our graduation rates, we can look at schools in Florida that are in areas that have 90%, 95% free and reduced lunch, almost 100% minority students. And you look at their graduation rates, a lot of them show you that they're at 95, 98% graduation rate when statewide average is close to 89 to 90. What are they doing there? What are the things that are being done there? That's what we call a gap buster, right? And the gap we're talking about is the achievement gap between a low socioeconomic student and a student that's more well off. I think what you're seeing is the implementation of strong, rigorous standards, rich content, and really holding schools accountable. I think the mix of that with the leverage point of having school choice. So school choice creates the competition that drives these schools to become better. And you have an accountability measure. Parents say, if you're not meeting it here, I can decide in Florida. In fact, almost 1 million students in Florida decide that families do that. They choose choice. So accountability measures in place keeps the pressure on, keeps the expectations in. They don't meet them, you take choice. Right? So that's what drives the engine of Florida's education system.
And as we back up a little bit, I wanted to mention, and we didn't talk about this earlier, but Florida and Mississippi are 2 of the states that have had the best gains in reading over the last decade. And that's huge because Mississippi used to be the state that was always at the bottom. And so to see that kind of achievement in Mississippi and in Florida in reading, that's significant, not just for third graders and fourth graders, because you need to learn how to read so that then you can read to learn later on, right? That's the saying. But because the share of individuals who are incarcerated, it is a significant proportion of those who are incarcerated can't read. Okay, so illiteracy is a major issue if you don't learn how to do it in third and fourth grade. Okay, so we've talked about some of the bad stuff here. Let's begin to move on to some of the skills that young people are learning, because it's one thing to mention, as you said, these core knowledge ideas, as well as learning to read with proficiency at a key point in a child's young life. But then there's this idea of soft skills and students being able to interact with other adults, to be not afraid to make mistakes, to be able to take risks. Let's talk about these soft skills for a minute, because there are two major things that states as well as the federal government have tried to fix education in the U.S. The first thing they tried was money. Okay, during COVID-19, the federal government gave about $190 to $200 billion to schools across the U.S. That is about 3 to 4 times what they give the K-12 system annually. Okay, it was a massive amount of money, and obviously didn't have the intended results. And education funding in the United States has been on a steady increase going back as far as we have numbers, okay? Even for adjusting for inflation. We are somewhere in the neighborhood today of $17,000, $18,000 per child, depending on where you are. Florida is well below that. So the first thing that the federal government and many states tried was more money. That has not been successful. The second thing has been this idea that we need more diversity, equity, and inclusion in K-12 schools. It's been to change school culture away from a focus on knowledge and skills to this very amorphous idea that there is a sense of guilt hovering in the background of American life that we can't seem to get around, and DEI is somehow going to get us through it. So let's talk about those for a minute. So soft skills in Florida, and just in general, Commissioner, as you've interacted with other state superintendents of education, how have superintendents been dealing with this issue of having kids ready to grow up so that they can be prepared for the workforce?
Well, I think after 40 years of nation at risk and kind of seeing the entire system go to a competency-based education system, and what that means is you're trying to teach for specific skills in hopes for that to be the outcome. But what happens is these things are done in a style where it's you drill, right, and then you test, and so it all stays in short-term memory. So a kid learns some words or learns some concepts, you test, they erase that from RAM, and they go on to the next thing. And I think at the end result, what do we hear from the employers, what do we hear from industry is they don't have the soft skills. If I can find a motivated employee that's willing to come on time, that can communicate both written, by the way, and verbally, look at people in the eyes, right? Because we know what this generation has an issue with, and that's a whole social media conversation, electronic device conversation that we can have for another day. But if we can find somebody that can do that, and then if you have the background knowledge, right, the core knowledge, the soft skills take care of themselves. So if we put a kid through kind of, almost for a better term, just a classical basic knowledge education, when they come out of that, they know how to read, so they can teach themselves practically anything, right? They know how to write, which is important and a skill that is very rare now. And they know how to verbally communicate. So think of all those skills you already acquired without trying to. You're building a core knowledge that allows that student to be really a lifelong learner. Because again, going back, I hate to beat the dead horse, but you got to learn how to read to be able to learn, and that's, I think, the problem. And reading comprehension is not a general skill, and so you have to have shared knowledge that you can then apply the rest of your life. And so when you go to a competency-based education, that's a problem because you're skimming off the top, right? And it's not going in your long-term memory. So when you go through that process and you have strong standards, right, and you have strong content, those soft skills will take care of themselves, and it's going to be better, produce a better workforce, going to be better for the economy ultimately. Even though it seems like a completely academic exercise, in reality, the output is going to affect the economy regardless.
Well, because it's a perpetual adolescence, if not, right? You're essentially having kids frozen in adolescence if you don't give them these skills and the ability to enter an office, like you were saying, basic things, shake hands, look someone in the eye, be on time, be persistent, finish tasks from, the start all the way to the end. These are all important things that young people should be learning in school, but when you lower the standards and when we are complacent, okay, with these basic skills, you're making adolescence last well longer through the teenage years, even into early adulthood. All right, I want to talk about why school choice in particular is a solution to these problems. But before we get to that, we need to say a word here about DEI, because DEI is not just an issue for K-12 schools in the United States, it also is for businesses. In fact, the latest report that I just completed for the Heritage Foundation, I looked at Fortune 500 companies and how many of them still have DEI statements saying that they had some commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I found that 486 out of the Fortune 500 still have commitments to DEI. Now that's remarkable, right? Because Walmart, number one on the Fortune 500 list, just disbanded its DEI operations. Microsoft, number 13, just said DEI is not business critical, which would be accurate, earlier this year. John Deere, Tractor Supply, Boeing, Coors Brewing, all on the Fortune 500 list have realized that the evidence is clear. DEI programs actually create resentment, they lower tolerance, and they make workplaces very unpleasant. They've done the same to K-12 schools. So what's Florida done on this issue?
So you're telling me that Boeing figured out that we don't want the people building our planes, their positions to be decided by the color of their skin or their background. Instead, they prefer to have merit-based, where they're the most skilled and prepared to build the plane where we all have to fly in. Yeah,
one would think that'd be obvious.
Welcome to the world. Like it's malpractice on top. Let's take the cultural battle aspect out of it, which philosophically, obviously, I think this is a terrible thing. You're pigeonholing people by the color of their skin. It's insulting, right? If you're a quote unquote minority, to tell me that I would get a job just because I'm Hispanic, this is ridiculous. I don't want that job, right? But in operation, again, you are deviating from the mission when you have 40-something% of your kids that can't read at grade level in third grade, and you are worried about whether it's gender ideology or DEI. Those things don't matter. Regardless of the kid that's in front of you, they need to learn to read. I don't care if they're black, white, purple, and alien. We need to teach them how to read it. All of them
capable.
They're all capable. Yes. And they're individuals. So if there's an individual issue, whether it's a learning disability or whatever, it's pertaining to that individual, right? It's not pertaining to the class or the group they come from or the background. It just happens to be they have that issue. You need to address it. But you're not addressing it because they're Hispanic. You're not addressing it because they're black. You're addressing it because they have an issue. Again, if you apply that across the board, let's go back to merit-based. Let's go back to accountability. Let's go back to expectations. We underestimate kids all the time. If you lower the bar, that's what they're going to give you. But if you raise the bar, they will always surprise you, and they are resilient, regardless of color, creed, background, etc.
No, I agree. And really, this isn't an ideological point. The fact is that there are companies out there that still have on their websites commitments to hire people based on ratios of certain races that they want to have in their company. That violates Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, right? Fundamental civil rights law in the United States says that is illegal, okay? And yet companies are still doing this. K-12 schools are struggling with this. The higher education system has been struggling with this in a noteworthy way for many, many years. Florida, I would add, is one of the states that now says you cannot use taxpayer money for any sort of DEI program in a higher education campus, which helps to redirect the focus back to education and the culture of a school, which is really excellent. All right, so we have about 10 minutes left. I want to talk about the solutions. So Florida has ranked number 1 3 times in a row on the Heritage Foundation's Education Freedom Report Card. This is a research report that my institution produces every year for the last 3. I'm told that I would get in trouble if I used the term three-peat, because I guess there's somebody named Pat Riley in Florida who owns that term. He owns the basketball team. Yeah, okay, all right, well, anyway. All right, so Pat Riley. So I won't say three-peat, but if it was, it would be a three-peat. So what is Florida doing that has made it unique? And I'll prompt you because it's it's a rhetorical question, right? Florida is one of the leaders in the United States in charter schools, in education savings accounts, in school choice in general. So let's kind of walk through that for a minute. So on average in the US, okay, apart from, there are about half of the states in the US have some form of private school scholarship program. Otherwise, kids are assigned to school by zip code. That's the way it's been for a long time, okay? You grow up, you are assigned to your local traditional public school, you attend that school, whether you like it or not, whether it's meeting your needs, you go through elementary school, middle school, you move to the local high school, and then you graduate. Regardless of that school is failing for generations, whether that school has ineffective programs, you're just stuck. Florida, it's not that way. So what is it like in Florida?
Well, we start with the premise that education doesn't produce widgets, right? Every student is an individual. And for years, we've been having the push to people to try to make education about the collective. It's not about the collective. Every single one of these students is a human being, and they're very different. How does that apply to school choice? So in Florida, we have now 524,000 students in this Family Empowerment Scholarship / Educational Savings Account. That is larger. If that was a school district, it would be probably second or third. I think it would be second largest school district in the country. We have 406,000 students in charter schools in Florida. If that was a school district, it would be the third largest in the country. So that just gives you an idea for perspective of how many students in Florida are availing themselves of school choice. And as I mentioned before, the reason we do that is because in order to meet the needs of the individual student, you have to have not just a neighborhood school, which could be an A school, but it's not meeting the needs of this student. Johnny's not being met there, so he needs choice. You apply that philosophy across the board, and you start to see the clearer picture of families driving the decisions. Who knows? Second point of our philosophy is parents know best, right? So who's driving the educational decision-making when you have school choice, when you have a scholarship, when you have an ESA? It's the parent. What was the old system like in Florida? If you lived in this zip code at that address, that's the school you went to. In fact, I remember back being in the legislature at the very beginning, having a story where a parent was arrested for forging an address to get their kids in a better school. And they arrested her. So that's insane to think about in today's day and age, right? Where I just want to remind everybody, Florida's program is the largest in the country. But yes, we're seeing this spread across a lot of states in the country, fortunately for those kids. Because again, go back to that original premise. We think every kid is an individual student and we treat it that way. And number two, families have to be able to drive those decisions.
Well, and some of the ways that we have talked about school choice in the U.S. is that, well, we've always had school choice if you can up and move to the neighborhood where you want to move, but that simply isn't an option for every family, right? And that's why what Florida is doing is so essential. So it's remarkable because Florida now has the largest population of students using education savings account of any state in the country. With an account, the state deposits a portion of what would effectively be the child's part of the education funding formula into a private account that parents can use to buy education products and services for their children. So they can effectively customize their child's learning experience through a combination of curricular materials. They can pay private school tuition if they choose. They can pay for educational therapists, personal tutors. They can make a unique experience for their child, or they could choose a private school and choose a different school. It is like this now in Arizona as well. West Virginia now has a similar program. North Carolina has one. In fact, 11 states in the U.S. have what we would call an account-style program like this that is available to every child in the state. That is a remarkable change to the education landscape in the U.S. Similar story can be talked about with charter schools, right? Charter schools are public schools that have a private school board. They operate independently from a local school district. And so they also can choose what type of focus they want for their academics. They could be a STEM school. They could be a fine arts school. They could be a school for children with special needs. And Florida has almost 500,000 of students attending schools like that. Arizona, we've already mentioned, has similar options. Oklahoma, Iowa, Utah, just in the past year and a half, have created similar programs. Okay, so let's connect the end here back to the beginning. When you have parents able to identify their children's needs and pick the solution for them, that has huge ramifications for the workforce, right? Because then if you have a child who was struggling in their assigned school with, say, math, the parent can choose a STEM school and send their child. They can then blossom in that school and be better prepared for what comes after that. And you've seen that happen.
And not only that, we're tying it back to the beginning. So let's talk about the basics and the better output you get of the students' soft skills, regular going into the marketplace, right? But let's talk about the students that use school choice to go into career programs where it's stacking credentials, whether it be cybersecurity, whether it be the broadband sector. Now in Florida, we're investing in the semiconductor session because of Space Florida, right? So all of those are choices, and they're not just high school choices. Students are starting to choose those pathways in middle school now, and a family can direct that student to go, and that could be a private option. It could also, a lot of our school districts are now doing it. A lot of our charters are now doing it. So think of going through a pathway where when you're done with high school, you go straight into the workforce with these stacked credentials or certifications, and you're making $25, $27 an hour, which is what we're seeing out of our apprenticeship programs. So if the student decides after entering the workforce that they want to go back and get more credentials because they want upward mobility in their industry, they can. If they want to change industries, they can. But think of, what do you eliminate there? Now you're just not preparing a better workforce, period, soft skills, period, but also we're dealing with the issue of students being saddled with debt. You're solving for all of those issues. All of that affects the economy, because what happens is those students that are saddled with debt have less buying power, less purchasing power. They're going to be more finicky about what jobs they're taking because now they have a debt that they have to pay. So all of these, what we're trying to say is all these things are interconnected with education. But again, I want to bring it back. It starts with the very basic at the beginning. We have to prepare these students with the basics. They have to know basic math. They have to know how to read, so that we can then infuse all of the higher, content to them as they progress through the system. But those scores don't change. If you can't get it right by third grade, that's what our prisons are projected by. It's how we build prisons, third grade scores. Mm-hmm. If they make it, if they're proficient, the numbers are astronomical on their success, right? And so you can see in the time that we had, the entire ecosystem that we're trying to connect back to and its direct effects on industry and on the economy.
And that's why when we started with the low test scores and talked about how Florida is bucking that trend, that's why it makes such a big difference. It makes a difference in everything from the prison population to the success of the workforce. All right, we have about 1 minute and 50 seconds left. So I have a question for you. It's an easy one because we talked about it a little bit before. But so tell me about the U.S. Department of Education. If, I don't know, we close that tomorrow, how much of an effect would that have on the Florida Department of Education and what you do?
Zero or a net benefit, because literally, for people that don't understand with the U.S. Department of Education, it does nothing but get in the way of states like Florida, like Texas, trying to do things. They could certainly provide a lot of flexibility with the title funding that already comes from Congress. They can certainly provide flexibility when it comes to higher ed accreditation and having that become more of an open marketplace where our schools can determine, we're here with the FIU Adam Smith Center for Economic Freedom, and we have FIU represented. FIU should be able to choose whatever accreditor benefits FIU's students, and it should be a marketplace for accreditation. It shouldn't be forced accreditation.
And just to be clear, the accreditation is important because without it, you cannot accept students with federal loans, and so it affects how many students you can enroll. Accreditation is something that the federal government in the U.S. and Washington D.C. has just a vice grip on, and they tell schools who they can be accredited.
Right, that's become a cartel. When it was originally designed, as a validation, right, a continuous improvement model where accreditors you come in. Peer review, right? How do I go in and look from the outside at what you're doing in your institution and how do you improve things? But it's become a cartel of choking out, deciding whether dollars get to you or not. And that's not what it was designed for. I think that open and flexible, and if you ask our schools, you probably are going to get the same answer. They'd rather be able to choose which one fits them better.
And so just to close, the U.S. Department of Education only provides less than 10% of the amount per child for every child in the U.S. 90% of the spending on public school students in the U.S. comes from state and local sources. The federal government only does about 10%. So if we're talking about piles of money, the federal pile is considerably smaller than what's coming from.
And not only that, if they shut down tomorrow, the money that's appropriated from Congress would still come to us, and the state would still distribute it based on the letter of the law to the school districts. And so all of that funding is not going away unless Congress decides they're going to not fund that anymore. That has nothing to do with the Department of Education. In fact, I heard that if you go by that building of 4,000 employees, there's nobody there right now. They're literally still remote working since COVID. So if they're not there, how much were they really doing?
Commissioner Díaz, thank you very much for all that you do and for your leadership. Please join me in thanking Commissioner Díaz